Welcome to another tutorial video, and today I'm going to show you how to use Aperture Priority for wildlife photography. Aperture Priority really is like a bridge between a fully automatic mode and fully manual, so we can call it a semi-automatic mode. On most cameras it's going to be A or AV, which keeps it nice and simple. So I'm going to put my camera now onto Aperture Priority, which is AV on the Canon. With Aperture Priority, we are in control of the aperture, the f-stop, so we choose the aperture depending on how we want the picture to look, and the camera is automatically going to choose the other settings so we don't have to think about them. So I'm going to use the dial on the top of the camera, and you can see here, just demonstrating, as I change the aperture, so I'm starting at a wide aperture of f5.6, as I change the aperture and go down using a smaller aperture to let in less light, you can see the camera's automatically compensating by choosing the shutter speed. So as I let in less light with a smaller aperture, the camera is letting in more light with a slower shutter speed. And you'll notice at the moment that I've got my ISO set on 400. I'm going to come to that later in the video. We're in control of the aperture, but why would you want to change the aperture in the first place? Well, changing the aperture, changing the f-stop is going to affect to some extent the background, how that looks in your images. So if you were to use a fairly wide aperture, that would be f5.6 on this lens, or maybe f4 or even f2.8 on some lenses, then you're going to throw the background much more out of focus, and you're going to enable the bird or the animal to stand out really clearly against that background. Now there are situations where you might want to use a smaller aperture. Let's say for example the subject is quite close and you feel you need a bit more depth of field. In this case you might want to go down to f8 or even smaller, just to get a little bit more depth of field rather than just the eye or just the face. Or maybe for example you want to photograph a group of animals and you don't just want one in focus, to try and get a couple or all of the group in nice sharp focus. So again then you might want to close your aperture down a little bit smaller. I think Aperture Priority is actually a really good exposure mode, and I recommend it for a lot of people. And one of the reasons I like it is because it doesn't have a limitation on available light like Shutter Priority does. If you're not sure what I mean by that, then go and check this video here on Shutter Priority. So even in the situations where the light levels fall, your shutter speed might get slower, but you'll always be able to take a picture, and you'll never get any instances where the camera says it just can't do it. So here we can see in practice in the field how this exposure mode is working. I start off by pointing towards the sky outside the woodland, and then as we come into the woodland, so effectively the light levels are dropping, you can see that the shutter speed is getting slower to let in more light. What if your shutter speed isn't fast enough? What if it's too slow? Well, this is where your ISO comes in. You need to do something with the ISO. So I've come here to this patch of woodland just to show you this in practice. So the light levels now are much lower than outside in the sun. Now if I wanted a shutter speed here of 1/500th of a second, again for photographing wildlife, at the moment on ISO 400, even at the widest aperture of f5.6 on this lens, I'm only getting 1/100th of a second, which is not really anywhere near to what I'm after. Now because using a higher ISO means we don't need as much light to get the same exposure settings, if I increase the ISO then it's automatically going to increase the shutter speed. So we're going to try this. So I'm going to go from ISO 400 and I'm going to go all the way up to 1600 because that should be about right. And we can see the shutter speed's gone up instantly to 1/400th of a second, just automatically like that. So I'm just going to increase the ISO by one more increment to 2000, and there we have it now. The shutter speed now is 500th of a second for what I wanted. So that's basically the principle in terms of how to adjust the ISO, of how the exposure works with Aperture Priority. What I would advise though is actually using automatic ISO. I think it works so much better and it's so much easier. So what we do here, we're going to go into automatic ISO as the plane goes over. Now there's one really important thing if you're using automatic ISO with Aperture Priority, and that is the minimum shutter speed. So I think this is really crucial, makes a big difference. So if we go into ISO speed settings. Now in here it's got minimum shutter speed and it's got options. Now it might be on auto. If you leave this on auto, the likelihood is what's going to happen is it's going to change the ISO first. It's going to increase the ISO as the light levels get lower, and then it's going to drop the shutter speed after. Now that doesn't seem the best way to work for me. So I think it's much better if you select a minimum shutter speed. So on my camera, I'd go in and I'd select a minimum shutter speed of, for example, 1/500th. You want to select whatever you think is fast enough for what you want to do. Set that as the minimum shutter speed, and then what happens is on Aperture Priority with automatic ISO, the first thing that will change if your light levels get lower, so if cloud comes over, for example, you go into a woodland where the light is getting lower, the first thing that will happen is your shutter speed will go down to let in more light, but it'll only go down as far as the minimum shutter speed that you've set, that you've locked in there. Then now what happens after that, if it gets any darker than that, that's when the ISO will kick in. The ISO will then start to go up to compensate because it doesn't need as much light. So first thing will happen is your shutter speed goes down to a minimum, and then your ISO is going to go up. And one thing to bear in mind is you want to select a maximum ISO for that reason as well. What about the disadvantages of Aperture Priority? Well, to be honest, I don't think there are really many disadvantages at all. I really like it. I prefer it to Shutter Priority. I think it's really, really good for beginners as well. Probably the main disadvantage is just in terms of knowing what your shutter speed is. So a lot of the time you do want a fast shutter speed. And do you know if you've got that or not? What I'd say is just glance in the viewfinder. Just try and get into the habit of just glancing in the viewfinder and just checking your shutter speed now and again. And if you need to adjust something, you know, probably the ISO, then just adjust that accordingly. Or if you use auto ISO with a minimum shutter speed, then that fixes the shutter speed problem for you. Absolutely perfect in my opinion. If you want to learn more about exposure, then check this video up here, which is a really, really in-depth video all about exposure and covers most of the different exposure modes as well. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you next time.